Welcome to Faith and Lit, a podcast exploring the intersection of books and belief. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Xandra Carroll. Our current series is Talking Tolkien, and I'm joined by Kasey Leander and Dr. Simon Barry. This week, we're looking at Tolkien's interplay between fiction and reality. Lest any ado need be furthered, let's join the guys. Hi everyone, and welcome to Faith and Lit. Today we're continuing our series Talking Tolkien, where we're discussing that great mind which gave us The Lord of the Rings, among other works. And last week we talked about how Tolkien's masterful creativity seemed almost boundless, yet paradoxically it was rooted within the reality of our world, and that's part of what made it so rich and dynamic. Today's topic is going to be focused on reality and fiction, so kind of in the same vein of last week. And I'm joined again by Kasey Leander and Dr. Simon Barry. How are you guys doing?
Wonderfully, Xandra, wonderfully. It's a thrill to be here and to discuss Tolkien. The privilege of a lifetime, I consider it. So thanks for having me on.
Privilege of a lifetime, high praise.
Well,
Man.
I don't want to overstate it.
What's happening in your life, Kasey? You need help.
Let's just say I can die fulfilled now that I've gotten to do a podcast on Tolkien.
Okay, fair. How are you, Simon?
And
you're gonna have to translate that, and just to be clear, for us as well. It's not. Yeah, we don't speak Sindarin as well. Just lest the audience think that all three of us knew what that was. But
it was a greeting, so I said thank you. Oyona Eliala Alase is a slightly formal greeting that roughly translates as ever is thy sight a joy, or more loosely, good to see you, or nice to be here.
So Simon, we were talking about this and thought this might be a good thing to bring up at some point during the series too. But when you and I first met, you said a star shines on the hour of our meeting, but you said it in Sindarin, and that blew my...
Quenya, not Sindarin. There's two Elven languages, and Quenya is the more formal, esoteric one, which is appropriate for that greeting, which is a very solemn one. Elen si la lume no mentir levo, star shines upon the hour of our meeting, is a sort of benediction greeting in Quenya.
Right, you mentioned it. Quenya is like the equivalent of their Latin, of Tolkien's Latin, which is astounding. So my big question that I want to ask is, how long did it take you to learn these languages, and what induced you to start and memorize these languages of Tolkien?
Well, the short answer is that as a child I had the memory of an elephant but the social life of a skunk. Yes, as a child I perhaps had too much time on my hands, but I was fascinated by the depth of Tolkien's world. As I've said before, and we've talked about before, the sheer depth of his world building. And therefore I poured through the appendices. I tried to draw some of my own maps of the areas they described. I took up sword fighting in case I was ever dropped into one of Tolkien's worlds, but I also tried to learn what there was in the appendices of Tolkien's various languages he invented and the alphabets that went with them, or at least I succeeded in learning the Tenra, the script, Fëanorian script. I never quite mastered the runic, the Dwarven and then the Elven runic scripts. So learning them, I got the basics from the appendices, and that was just a matter of sort of trial and error, deciding I wanted to write something and sitting down to write it out in Elven. I did later acquire a book called The Languages of Tolkien's Middle-earth, which gives one a bit more to work with. I would not say I am anything like as fluent in Elven as I am in most of the other languages I know, but then it has less real-world applications than the more modern and trendy ones that I spent more of my time on, like Biblical Hebrew and New Testament Greek, medieval Latin. So
Very trendy.
Yeah, very
Those
trendy.
are trendy. They're so hot right now.
At Oxford, that's all the fashion.
So I actually wanted to ask you this too, and this may be a cultural difference between America and Great Britain, I'm not sure, but in some of the discussions I've had with some of my other friends who enjoy writing here in the States, at least two of them have sort of sat me down and said, hey, writing fiction is bad. It's bad to write fiction. It's evil to write fiction. And if you're going to be a person of faith, you shouldn't tell stories that are false. And they'll kind of talk about Tolkien and some of the other Inklings, C.S. Lewis, and how they created worlds that weren't true. And they talked about fairies, shame, and magic and wizards. Oh no. So I don't know. I thought I'd ask you, is that something you've come across in Great Britain, that view, and also how would you respond to that?
I don't think it's something I've ever come across in modern Britain. I think probably even the Christian community in Britain is perhaps a little less sensitive in some respects than parts of the Christian community in the US. I think I have come across some of those ideas in the writings of 16th, 17th century Puritans in the UK. So if you go back a few centuries, there's sometimes a similar unease. How I would respond to it? Well, there's a couple of pieces actually, I think, to the question, but the heart of it is this thing of, can you write fiction, or is it writing a lie? And I think I would want to say, and I need to take care to expand this statement properly. First of all, actually, that the Bible contains fiction, because Jesus tells parables, and you're clearly not supposed to believe that when he tells some of those parables, that he is talking about something that historically happened. The Lord who sends out his servants to drag people from the highways and byways into his wedding feast because his friends who said they'd come won't come, or the sower who goes out to sow and a quarter of the seed falls on the path. That's an incredibly incompetent sower, especially when the path is such a small part of the field. It's not historical, it's a parable. Now, the thing is, I think when he tells those stories, the Lord makes it very clear that he is telling fiction, he's telling a parable, and it is rooted in the real world. It is telling a truth, but it is using a fiction to do it, an acknowledged fiction to do it. And therefore, I don't think there's anything deceitful about fiction that is acknowledged as fiction. And actually, fiction can be one of the best ways to communicate truth, in the same way that the sort of paradoxical language of poetry can communicate truth in a much deeper and more profound way than we often can with prose. So fiction can be a way to communicate truth with an elegance and a beauty and a precision and an emotive power that sometimes it's much harder to communicate in bare, factual, propositional words. I find it very striking as a person of faith, as a minister in the Christian tradition, that the Christian Bible isn't a systematic, step-by-step, factual, theological document. It contains some that come pretty close to being that, but it also contains letters and poems and songs and all the rich genres of literature, because they each bring something to the table. And in the same way, I think fiction, really good fiction, one of the things that makes it good is that it tells the truth through fiction. And we've touched on this in previous sessions, when fiction encapsulates in a simple, visible form something that resonates with the truth of reality. The example I've kept using, and I'll stick to it for the sake of convenience, is the Nazgul and their pursuit of power and immortality, how it leads to them being slaves and trapped in death. And Tolkien himself spoke about this as when secondary art partakes of primary art, or has the flavour of primary art. And by primary art, he means creation, reality. As we spoke about last time, for Tolkien, our creativity is a delegated form of God's creativity. It partakes of it, it colours in the details. So when our creativity resonates with his creativity. That's when fiction expresses something of reality.
Xandra, it's so interesting to me that you've encountered that viewpoint more than once, because I've met people who dislike fiction, but I can honestly say I have never encountered someone who thought fiction was evil or wrong in some way.
Yeah, I definitely think it might be a fringe view. So I don't want to overgeneralize, but I'm just surprised this happened to me twice. I'm like, I guess there must be a lot of people out there who do think that it's wrong. Right.
But it does raise an interesting question for me, because I wonder if that viewpoint would have been more prevalent in Tolkien's day and age. And that's genuinely an open question just to put out there, because I'm not sure I have an answer. I can picture sort of the different themes of modernism versus romanticism competing in Britain, in sort of mid-century Britain. But I don't know, Simon, I don't know if you have any perspective on that, but would Tolkien have encountered that view that fiction is actually, it's wrong to spend this much time producing fiction?
I suspect he would. I mean, you have to remember that Tolkien was not a man of his age in many ways. He was somebody who delighted in and gave his life to the study of the literature of 1,000 years before. He was quite old-fashioned. Famously, actually, when so he was a Roman Catholic, when the Catholic Church switched the language of the Mass from Latin to English, Tolkien got very cross, and apparently would turn up to church and belt out all the responses in Latin so that nobody could hear the poor priest saying them in English, because he did not approve of this modernizing and doing things in English when any sensible person knew the Latin anyway. He was not a modernist. I suspect, and I'm not a historian of that period, I'm a medievalist myself, but I suspect that in the Oxford of Tolkien's day, you would have encountered those, not so much in Christian circles as in secular, who viewed the writing of fiction as silly, unhelpful, a distraction, certainly not something whose worth could be compared to real disciplines like the physical sciences, or perhaps philosophy or socioeconomics and politics. Right. And that was that very utilitarian perspective, I think, that was late 19th and first half of the 20th century in many ways, that said, you have to demonstrate the use of something, and if it's not increasing the standard of living, it's not useful. I suspect that would have been around, and I suspect Tolkien would have loathed it.
And that's fascinating to me, Simon, having lived in England for a year, because the post-war period between America and the UK was very different. I spent a week in East London one time, and the buildings are a very, I mean, it's got a very interesting, and I think really cool aesthetic right now. But a lot of the buildings are sort of a drab, like a brick. They all look identical. And when you sort of get over to the west side of London, things look different. Like, and I was told, actually, I learned that was because of the Blitz and the bombing that took place. And all of these warehouses were on the east side of London. And so that part of the city was just completely obliterated. And I think in a microcosm that could describe post-World War II England, which was sort of struggling to feed its population, and so many people had died in the war. Whereas in America, we had a huge boom. In England, there seemed to be more than one rough decade where people are just struggling to find life and beauty. And really, what you're saying makes perfect sense. Like opting for that utilitarian side of things, just trying to put food on the table and not worry about beauty.
I think in many ways, you've got to remember as well the shadow of the First World War, which in many ways may well have touched the UK more deeply than the Second. We had almost a century of peace, and then a war which killed about 1 million people out of a population of 40 million. You think about how the Vietnam War impacted the US, I gather, and that caused, 175,000 casualties out of a population of 260 million, I think, if I'm remembering my history. The UK in the First World War lost something like 4 to 5% of its male population, and mostly taken from the youngest, the brightest, and the most public-spirited, the ones who volunteered to go to war, because for the first few years it was a volunteer army entirely before conscription came in. It was a harvest of a generation. One German author, actually, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, that book is dedicated to the generation that the war destroyed, even those who came home from the shells. And that was Tolkien's world. The war destroyed a generation. It bankrupted the country. The country started to recover, and then the Great Depression hit. And in many ways, the UK, even before the Second World War, was in a bad way economically. The standard of living in East London before the war was terrible. Tiny homes, terrible quality of air, really thick, heavy smog, very hard to get, massive malnutrition. The Second World War came along and bombed much of London to the ground, killed another 1 million people, and put the country massively in debt. And the generation that grew up after the Second World War grew up under the shadow of the atom bomb. For much of the Cold War, the US was out of range of Soviet nuclear strikes, but the UK was target number one. And you guys had a 30-minute warning, we had a 5-minute warning. And that's not long enough to escape. It's a small country, so everyone knew if the Cold War goes hot, we all die. And there's no surviving for Britain. And I think that was a shadow which really burnt its way into the national psyche. Everybody knew if this goes hot, and there were a lot of times when they expected the Cold War would go hot, we all die, everyone we love dies, our country dies. That's the world Tolkien lived in, that's the story he lived through. That was the reality he lived through. And as we said when we started this series, the fact that in the face of that, he wrote stories that were ultimately about the triumph of hope, stories that kept asserting that the ultimate reality was the light, that was light and beauty up there that no shadow could ever touch. That speaks to Tolkien having his roots in something much better than his surroundings, much better than his times, much better than the years he lived through. There was a deeper reality that inspired his fiction because it inspired him.
Well said. Well said. And I just think that makes the literary tapestry that is the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world that much richer, just knowing what he lived through and what the backdrop was.
Simon, why do you think that fiction is so important, or was so important, just given the context that you've just described so well?
Thank you. And I think, and I'm sorry to keep referencing earlier sessions, but consider it an incentive to go and watch them if you haven't already. I think some of it looks back to what we were saying about Estelle and Umdir, if you remember that conversation. So Umdir is hope that is based on looking around you and saying, what can I reasonably expect? It's an expectation of good that, while not certain, may yet reasonably be looked for. Now, in the years Tolkien lived through, if you looked around, you didn't have much cause for Umdir, much cause for hope. And therefore, if you were writing what was factual, then, at least in Tolkien's eyes, I think he had a slightly over-jaundiced view, actually, of his world, but it's understandable what he lived through. In his eyes, if you were to write factually about his days, you would be writing a tragedy. His own comment was that if Lord of the Rings had been written as an allegory of the Second World War, as people claimed, then Saruman would have taken and used the ring, the world would have been divided between Isengard and Mordor, and the hobbits would have been held in contempt and used as slaves by both sides. Now that's, I think, an overly negative view, but it speaks to how he saw the world of his day. So why is fiction so important? Because when there is no Umdir, fiction can still open the door to Estelle, to the hope that is based in trust, in faith, in saying there is light and beauty up there that no shadow can touch, in saying that the ultimate reality of this world, the ultimate truth of this story, is the author who is telling it, and he will not allow the ending to be sad. So I think one of the great virtues of fiction, as Tolkien told it, was that it gave you Estelle when there was no Amdir, that it lifted your eyes from the darkness and despair of the world around to say, hey, just remember, you might be in Mordor, but the stars are still up there. That's why it's the opposite in some ways of the modern trend for realistic fantasy like Game of Thrones, which tries to take the high beauty of fantasy and drag it down into the dirt of modernity, where Tolkien tried to shine the light of fantasy in the gloom of his own day.
Into the gloom of modernity, if we're being honest.
If we're being honest, yes.
And that is fascinating, Simon. And that's why you see Tolkien also just such a huge theme in his books is his fear and his mistrust of the mechanization of things. And I don't think it's that he's against technology or sophisticated inventions and contraptions. He has the whole race of the dwarves, after all, which are pretty good with their fireworks and their toys and their mechanics. But he had witnessed just this hellscape of what modern machinery could produce.
Several times. Yes, I think the interesting distinction in Tolkien actually is that he loathes industry and loves craftsmanship. Because craftsmen make beauty with the talents they are given. They exercise their creativity, that secondary creativity colouring in the details of creation. Whether it's painting the colours on a clockwork toy or carving something in Lothlorien. Whereas industry, I think in his eyes, was mechanistic, inhuman and uncreative. It was production, not creation. And that's why he's really positive about the dwarves, but really negative about the factories of Isengard. They're both using the same technology fundamentally. Light a fire, make the metal hot, hit it with a hammer. But one of them is craftsmanship and one of them is industry. And for Tolkien, yes, I think industry was associated with the Somme and the Blitz and all the rest of it. But also, it was the opposite of, in his eyes, the opposite of creativity. And creativity was such a virtue for him, I think.
Simon, you write and you create, and I want to hear you talk about Tolkien's creative process and how, in ways that you relate with it. What was Tolkien's creative process? How did he create something so monumental and so massive?
I think, like most creation, it started very small. There are a couple of things that catch Tolkien's imagination when he's a young man. And one of them is actually from a set of Saxon antiphons for Easter, I think, which refers to Eärendil, light of the morning star. And it seems to be some kind of reference to an angel in the hymn. But Tolkien takes it and turns it into a poem about Eärendil. And Tolkien nerds amongst our listeners will recognise that name, because of course Eärendil ends up becoming a key figure in the narrative. He's the one who makes it through the Vale to solicit the aid of the Valar against Morgoth and bring the First Age to an end, who then becomes the morning star, sailing the skies with the light of the Silmaril on his brow, some of the light of which is put into the fire of Galadriel, which Frodo and Sam use on their journey. So he's quite a big character. He's also Elrond's dad, by the way, but that's another story. So there he starts with a word. There's an image he visits. Now I'm trying to remember which city it is. I think it's Windsor he visits one day in the fog and has this image just of towers rising above the fog and starts writing about Tocher Essea, the Lonely Isle, seen rising from the mists of the sea. And of course the other great inspiration is his relationship with his wife Edith, which is the inspiration for the story of Beren and Luthien. So we've touched upon this a little bit before. Tolkien, of course, when he was 16, met Edith, but was banned from seeing anything of her by his guardian because she was Anglican, he was Catholic. And Tolkien Tolkien had a very strong obedience to authority, so he had no further contact with her for 5 years, until 12 minutes past midnight on his 21st birthday, when the guardianship lapsed, where he promptly sat down and wrote and proposed. Part of their relationship, of course, was Tolkien returning pretty much broken from the war in the West, wounded psychologically and sick physically, and Edith taking him for a walk in the woods and dancing, trying to cheer him up. And we know from some of Tolkien's letters that was the inspiration for that great scene in the Lay of Lithien, where Beren stumbles, broken from the mountains and the horrors of Tar Nafuin, into Beleriand and sees Lúthien Tinuviel dancing in the starlight. And Tolkien has that image again and starts writing a poem about it, the Lay of Lithien, which gets up to about 4,500 lines before he starts rewriting it after sending it to C.S. Lewis for comments, and that's a whole wonderful correspondence. But again, writing that poem, he starts building up the world behind the poem. So I think Tolkien starts with a few images, and he starts with a love of mythology and the great Norse sagas. And he really seems to have felt that England lacked a mythology. There's a sort of folk mythology from most of the other countries in Europe, but a lot of ours was wiped out in the Norman conquest, so blame it on the French again. Tolkien set out to create an English, fictional, a fake English folk mythology. And so the very earliest editions of his stories were supposed to have been told to Eärendil the mariner, who had sailed to Valinor and met the elves who had told him the stories of elven days. Now that whole story, I beg your pardon, not Eärendil, Ælfwein the mariner. That whole story line, that whole origin is dropped, although Ælfwein survives as the name of Faramir and Eowyn's son, Ælfwein of Rohan, and Ithilien, but that's not a story. So he felt a need, a lack, a void in English folk mythology. He loved the Norse mythology and he wanted to create something like it. And then specific images and moments and ideas seem to have been the trigger.
Do you think he succeeded in creating an English mythology? Or do you think he just created something entirely different altogether?
Well, he accidentally founded the genre of high fantasy, as you do. I think in a way he didn't create an English mythology, but he created a shared mythology that has spread across the English-speaking world and beyond. He created a shared world and a set of shared stories and images to inhabit, which is a lot of what a mythology was. And, well, we are people separated by thousands of miles of ocean, and yet we're able to speak about that world and to co-inhabit it and to share those stories. So he created a mythology for the English-speaking world and beyond. Not a mythology in the sense that anyone thinks it's literally true, but a mythology that perhaps still has the power to communicate truth. It's honest, it doesn't claim to be telling history the way that other mythologies do. It's honest about being fiction, and yet because of this thing of Tolkien's about trying to make secondary art echo primary art, trying to make it encapsulate, crystallize, and show in simple form the forms of our world in the Platonic sense, I think it's full of truth, and it teaches truth. And I know there have been, it sounds silly, but there have been times in my life when having grown up reading Tolkien was really helpful to me, because it instilled truths and images and ideas that are true. The stories by which Tolkien communicated them aren't true, but the truths in those stories are. And I know I'm not the only one. I was reading something the other day by Randall Munroe, if you know XKCD cartoons. He's a US web cartoonist, works at NASA, I think. He's a technophile, bit of a geek, atheist, very different to me. But he was writing about how helpful that story where Sam sees the light shining above the clouds in Mordor, how helpful that had been to him. Two very different people, different countries, different professions, different beliefs, but we both found this a shared truth in Tolkien. So I don't think he managed to make an English mythology, but I think he managed to do something better. And I think part of the key to it was that his work it's not allegory, but it has great applicability because its roots go down into this poetic appropriation and appreciation of the patterns of reality.
Well said.
Yeah, that is such a good point, and it's incredible to hear how many people have been helped by his writings, and it encourages me as a writer to think, what meaningful thing can I create? How can I be a craftsman, a wordsmith, so to speak, and not just belch out a bunch of random novels that are going to entertain people. So yeah, that is a very encouraging thought.
What an incredibly valuable use of one's time. And I don't know if Tolkien ever felt like he wasn't making good use of his time, but he certainly was. And I resonate with you, Simon, in the sense that, as a 12-year-old reading these books for the first time, they made me want to live for something bigger and better than the ways my world could feel small at times. It really did inspire me to say, listen, there's acts of courage and heroism, and those exist, and they're worth pursuing. And yes, is that dramatic? Heck yes. And I was a dramatic teenager because of it. But I do think it's made me much better. And so I'm grateful. I'm grateful Tolkien took the time to pour as much as he did into his fiction. Like I mentioned, I'm about an eighth of the way through Unfinished Tales, which I'm reading for the first time. And my mind is just blown again and again. It's not like a particularly readable book in the same way that the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings trilogy is. It's a textbook. It's the history he made. It's like the Silmarillion on steroids. But now I appreciate it so much just because I see you're talking about craftsmanship. This was not industry to Tolkien. This was craftsmanship. And he did a masterful job.
I think a lot of modern writing tends to be more mass production because that's what the publishing houses want, is a whole series of books to sell. But Tolkien took the time to make not a grand series, but a masterpiece. I mean, I think some of the irony is that, of course, he never intended to write a book like Lord of the Rings. He wanted to write the Silmarillion and with mythic tales. But then he got to telling stories about hobbits to his son, and friends said, you should publish it, so he did. And the publishing house came and said, we want a sequel. And Tolkien said, well, would you be interested in all this mythic history? And they said, no, we want funny tales about hobbits. So he said, okay, and wrote Lord of the Rings. But the thing about it is that it melds that depth of world building with the sort of relational human truth of the hobbits. And the synthesis is something that is both idealistic and realistic, relatable and aspirational. Something that resonates with our ordinary everyday experience, but also partakes of the mythic and the glorious and the transcendent. And the result was, well, the best-selling work of English literature in the second half of the 20th century, after the Bible.
Thanks for tuning in to Faith and Lit. Join us next week for our final episode of the Talking Tolkien series, where we'll be exploring Tolkien's eucatastrophe. And if you don't know what eucatastrophe means, be sure to watch. Eucatastrophe, I catastrophe, we all catastrophe. Anyway, see you next week. You book nerd you. Keep on reading.